Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to thank the Latin American Studies Program, Professor Raymond Kreb, Bill Fallman, and in particular Sergio, who has been helping me since I arrived yesterday. Today I will be presenting part of my current dissertation research on the music of the Muisca indigenous community in Colombia. I would like to begin this talk by asserting some basic facts about the Muisca indigenous group for those of you who are not familiar with it. Since the proclamation of Colombia as a multicultural nation-state in 1991, the government has granted legal recognition as indigenous group to 5 Muisca communities, 2 in the capital city, Suba and Bosa, and 3 in the Bogotá Plateau. The current population of the 5 communities altogether probably ranges between 5,000 and 6,000 people. This image that you see here, it was taken during my last summer fieldwork in Bogotá, and it shows a protest of the Bosa Muisca community. They protest against the construction of social housing projects in their territory. The local administration, and the building that you see behind the yellowish building, it's the governor's office, did not consult them on the construction project, which violates their indigenous right of prior consulting before developing any action in their territory. The community walked from the Santander Square, where the Gold Museum is located, to the Bolivar Square. This is the Bolivar Square. And upon arrival, they gathered around the fruit mandala that you see in the picture. The man walking in white clothes and with a mochila is one of the shamans of the community of Bosa, and he is giving a speech on the importance of respecting the territory for the survival of culture. He is surrounded by some of the youths from the new generations of musicians, and you see some musical instruments there. In this type of political demonstrations, the Muiscas repeatedly play the song Muisca Soy, or I am Muisca, in a Pan-Andean style, which works as an hymn of the community. And I would like you to listen to it for a moment. The Muisca revitalization, along with other cases of indigenous revival in Colombia and in Latin America, has been highly controversial. Indigenous revival creates suspicions in citizens and bureaucrats who often consider the claims of indigeneity as inauthentic and opportunistic. On a symbolic level, the Muisca revitalization in the last 2 decades interrupts official narratives of the nation in which the Muiscas, as the indigenous subjects whose territory became the epicenter of colonization, soon disappeared because of colonial violence and imported illnesses, and thus belong to a glorious past.
Is this golden raft the key to El Dorado? Because it's made by a Muisca craftsman and shows Muisca people. Because they are long gone and their cultures disappear. This is the closest we can come to hearing them speak for themselves.
Those protrusions there.
The raft is priceless because of the technological complexity and because it's a memory of the past of Colombia.
This is a Smithsonian Channel video that refers to perhaps the most iconic piece of the Muisca community, the Muisca raft, which is in the Gold Museum. This raft depicts a ritual in which the chief or cacique, covered in golden power, goes into the water of a sacred lagoon to pray to the gods. This object, and in general the fine pieces produced by Muisca goldsmiths, gave birth to the legend of El Dorado. In this video, we heard the official narrative of the Muisca extinction. I would like just to recall a few sentences. The narrator said, "Because they, the Muisca people, are long gone and their culture disappeared," or "This is the closest that we can come to hearing them, the Muiscas, speak for themselves," or "The Muisca raft is priceless because of the technological complexity and because it is a memory of the past of Colombia." The Muiscas contradict the official narrative by explaining their continuous occupation of the territory and the continuation of cultural practices. In this talk, I would like to explain the complexities of the Muisca re-emergence in the multicultural context. First, I will analyze the central tensions of the Muisca revival. This includes the doubts about the authenticity of the music and of the indigenous subjects who produce it, and the indigenous wish for autonomy to decide how to shape their identity. I will then explore the mechanisms for the recognition of indigenous subjects and how re-emerging groups face difficulties to attain recognition because of the type of primordial Indianness they are required to perform. Finally, I turn to the Muisca musical practices to exemplify how the Muiscas challenge the official mechanism of recognition by providing new forms of cultural revitalization that still evidence the primordial Indianness. To introduce you to the Muisca indigenous community context, which is full of political implications, cultural efforts, passions, and battles, I bring an ethnographic account that will allow social actors to present their own views on the subject. This ethnographic account was unexpected. I had no idea that an invitation to present at an academic event in Bogotá would become the setting of a very important fieldwork event. And I have to confess here, I was very naive thinking that fieldwork only happens where you go and do fieldwork. I never expected that in this academic space with 100 students, this would happen. On October 2014, I was invited to present a paper about my ongoing research in the Colombian Thought lecture series organized by the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. That year's lecture series, entitled Cátedra Muisca, or Muisca Seminar, was dedicated to present studies on the Muisca indigenous culture from the pre-Hispanic period to the present, and a comparison of the Muisca language, Muiscabun, with other languages of the Chibcha linguistic family. The paper I presented that day focused on the thoughts and work on cultural revitalization of a group of youths from the Muisca Cabildo of Suba. I analyzed two examples, a Muisca soundscape project and the cultural and musical activities of the public-funded Muisca preschool. The Soundscape project, which was available as a web page for a few years, was developed to preserve the memories of living elders about the transformation of the Muisca territory of Suba. In a way, the project constructed a digital archive of the memories of the living elders of the community and of the current activities of the community towards cultural revitalization. The project contains several recordings, including interviews with the elders of the community and live recordings of children of the preschool singing songs related to the topic. I focused on 3 short audiovisual pieces that the youths call soundscapes, in which a voice-over narrates stories on the recovery of ancestral Muisca culture. The narrative is accompanied with music and still images of pre-Hispanic Muisca gold archaeological artifacts. Through the analysis of these materials, I intended to establish the position of the youths from Suba on cultural revitalization as part of the larger multicultural politics. The last example was an excerpt of the song La Guapucha, that I had recently recorded during an interview session with Jenny and Wilmer, musicians and cultural leaders of SUA. At that time, I didn't say much about the musical features of the children's song, except that it was yet another edge of cultural revitalization. I finished my presentation by making the echoey room resound with Jenny's sweet and soft voice, singing a simple melody with lyrics about the guapucha, which is a small fish species central to the pre-Hispanic Muisca diet that still survives, accompanied by a rhythmic pattern on the tambora, which is a two-headed drum. So I'd like to replicate here that rhythm and try to get an idea of the song that they were playing, okay? So maybe you can help me with it? Yeah. Nada, 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 pececito, nada, nada, nada en la laguna, nada, 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 pececito, nada, nada, nada en la laguna, viene el balsero, te viene a pescar, con un sedazo, él te va a sacar, vas a alimentar a los muiscas de Suba. Vas a alimentar a los niños su mamá. Her voice sounded much more sweet and beautiful. So she was, I closed the presentation by Jenny singing this. The sweet voice of the musical example contrasted heavily with the round of questions and comments that continued. The strong statements of the students and colleagues produce an animated discussion that finely depicts the central tensions of the Muisca revitalization process, all linked to the multicultural politics of the 1990s. Although my presentation was not oriented towards a musicological discussion for a specialized audience, the first comment was about indigenous music. A woman argued vehemently that as a musician student, she did not consider that the music I had used as illustrations of my paper was indigenous music, or that the people that I was talking about were real Indians. To exemplify her judgments, she argued that to her La Guapucha, the song that I just performed, was interpreted in a pop voice, which mismatches the prototype of the indigenous voice. She also complained about the text of the soundscape Hichakene, its Muisca strength, which she considered that belonged to the Disney princesses stories, with a machista message that encouraged women to behave like the indigenous goddess Bagwe, mother and weaver, and men to behave like warriors. The student extended the question of the authenticity to the subjects themselves and doubted if they are Indians or not, because of the politically favorable conditions for the Muisca re-emergence at this particular moment in history. This reaction is quite common in citizens who get surprised when they found out that there are Muiscas who live in the city. It is also common in nation-state officials who granted the legal recognition but with a lot of difficulties, and in scholars who consider these type of groups as second-class indigenous communities. The next comment was equally passionate and answered most of the first students' critiques. The woman identified herself as a student majoring in industrial design and the singer of the Muisca children's song. She explained to her mate that the Muiscas in Suba perform music as a part of a process of cultural revitalization, a process that was born out of the collection of memories of the elders and was oriented to transmit the knowledge of the younger generations. She also explained that their music was not intended to satisfy the academic community and that the validation of the Muisca educational projects should not be ruled by academia or the nation state, but by the members of the community. And she said, and I quote, "If the elder Anatilda dances to our song and thinks it is suitable for the community, then I am satisfied. I do not perform for scholars, I perform for my people. I do not need the approval of scholars who tell me if this music is indigenous or not. If she approves the song, we will play it for the community." Although I hate to pause this ethnographic account here without detailing other students' and speakers' comments that continue and were equally interesting, I need to explain the tensions of the cultural process that were outlined in these two comments, including the concern about the authenticity of sound and culture and the political mechanisms for recognition and survival of cultural difference. The first student states a double doubt. She questioned the legitimacy of the music as indigenous music and of the subjects who produce it as indigenous subjects. The music is questioned because the example with which I finished the talk does not resemble the sonic idea of an indigenous sound, and in particularly the idea of a South American indigenous sound. The indigenous subjects are also questioned because their cultural practices do not match the stereotype idea of indigeneity requested in multicultural politics, and because the re-emergence of the Muiscas and of many other indigenous communities in Colombia coincides with the constitutional shift that recognized positive rights for ethnic minorities for the first time. In 1990, the Cabildo of Suba, located in one of the most overpopulated neighborhoods of the capital city, was the first Muisca community to be recognized, right in the midst of the proclamation of Colombia as a multicultural nation-state. The mismatch between the expected Indian versus the real Indian led many government officers and citizens to disqualify the cultural revitalization process and consider it merely an opportunistic move to obtain positive rights reserved for ethnic minorities. The second tension oscillates between the wish for an autonomous indigenous government that can take political, administrative, and cultural decisions solo, without taking into account the opinion of social actors outside their community, and the type of indigeneity within multiculturalism, in which indigenous groups must be officially recognized by government officers and academics to be fully accepted as indigenous communities. Despite the wish of the indigenous community who wants autonomy to carry out their cultural recovery, obtaining and maintaining the recognition depends on the interaction with the nation-state and the academia. It is ironic that the indigenous group depend on legal recognition to have access to ethnic rights, which are exactly designed to guarantee their survival as indigenous subjects. To provide a contextualization of the tensions outlines, I turn now to the mechanisms of recognition of indigenous subjects in Colombian politics of indigeneity and the challenges, especially for re-emerging indigenous communities. The legalization of the pluriethnic and multicultural character in most Latin American nation states during the 1990s was developed both through the ratification of the International Labour Organization Convention 169 on Indigenous People and on the constitutional reforms. In the 90s, 14 countries in Latin America switched their constitutions. This Convention 169 recognizes the existence of indigenous pueblos who are differentiated by social, economic, and cultural conditions from the rest of national society and thus are entitled to positive rights. These rights include cultural, territorial, and linguistic rights, and the need to be consulted regarding public measures that might affect them, and force tribunals to take into consideration customary laws regarding their affairs. This is the reason of the Muisca protest with which we started. The community was not consulted on the construction of a social housing project on their territory. The constitutional reforms recognized the pluriethnic and multicultural character of national societies and acknowledged the differential rights already recognized by the Convention 169 as a form of positive discrimination to those politically, economically, and socially marginalized groups. Among the gains of the indigenous movement and other marginalized pueblos who had been fighting for decades was to obtain the most basic right, the right to have rights as citizens. The 1991 Colombian constitutional reforms was one of the earliest, and it was perhaps the most extensive constitutional regime of ethnic rights in Latin America at the time. It was soon adopted as a model for the rest of Latin America. However, as we will see, it is highly problematic for indigenous community, particularly for re-emerging ones. The definition of an indigenous subject under the Colombian law is based on recognizing and respecting a collective right over a territory and the right to self-government with autonomous legal systems. The collective territorial rights are regulated through the creation of resguardos or indigenous reserves. Even though the constitutional reform approved a new legislation for collective territories or indigenous territorial entities, it only started to be implemented a decade later, and unfortunately, we remain with the colonial form of resguardos. The public nature of indigenous authorities is regulated through the figure of cabildo, which is a collective government body composed of indigenous authorities elected by members of the resguardo. The cabildo has the authority to autonomously rule over their territory and design and implement development plans, exercise indigenous customary law to resolve disputes within the community, and to raise and administer taxes and receive a portion of national income comparable to that allocated to Colombian municipalities. The Ministry of Interior has recognized 5 Muisca cabildos, the 3 rural in Chía, Cota, and Sesquilé, and 2 in Bogotá, Suba and Bosa. Only, however, the Muisca Cabildo of Chía has been granted resguardo territory, and that happened a year ago. The other 4 communities are recognized as a form of indigenous government, but they will probably not get any territory, especially the ones in Bogotá. The recognition of these 2 core rights also included other cultural, juridical, and political rights derived from these 2. Free health services, the right to a bilingual and bicultural education, free access to university, no military service and land taxes, right to protect their environment, and the right to 2 senators elected nationally by a special electoral circumscription. The recognition of ethnic rights and, in general, the positive identification of indigenous subjects produced with the constitutional shift generated an increase of political and ethnic mobilization. It included 2 opposite movements: the re-Indianization of many Andean communities who were previously identified as campesinos or as mestizo communities. It also included the de-Indianization of other communities, such as the working class subaltern Cusqueños, who self-identify as indigenous mestizos and reject the category of Indians as a way to fight racism in Peru. The authenticity of the re-emerging groups, however, is constantly questioned. If the motivation for re-emergence is to have access to these positive rights to solve their social problems, then they are opportunistic, and probably the cultural traditions they are representing as proof of their ethnicity are illegitimate. Here I would like to use Sears Storm's quote regarding the increase of American Indian and Alaska Native population at the end of the 20th century that matches exactly the Latin American condition. And she asks, "Are these race shifters little more than wannabes without any real claim to indigenous identity? Or does the turn to embrace Indianness measure recognition of native genealogies that earlier generations chose or were forced to deny in the age of assimilationism? The dividing line lies between consider these subjects as mere race shifters, empowered wannabes, fake Indians who want to obtain indigenous rights as a solution for their social problems without preserving a real cultural particularity, or recognizing the historical conditions of indigenous communities during the 19th and 20th century, during which the nation-state tried to construct a nation based on the idea of the tri-ethnic mestizaje." The Muisca authenticity has been questioned not only from citizens, such as the student at the conference that I talk to you, but from public officers during and after the 5 Muisca cabildos obtained legal recognition. In Bogotá, the Suba Cabildo received an early recognition. It was the first of the Muisca communities and the first of any urban cabildo in the country. But their recognition was withdrawn in 1999. The Ministry of Interior dissolved the Cabildo because of a report by Bogotá's Public Health Office regarding a suspicious increase of the Muisca population with access to free health services. The Muisca health census went from about 600 to 7,000 individuals in a period of 6 months. The community then started a legal battle to regain the recognition as an indigenous community. The Council of State forced the Ministry of Interior to conduct a socio-economic study to determine their indigeneity. The study concluded that the community was not sufficiently differentiated from the rest of the Colombian population, and it said, they lack a common history as well as group cohesion, a deep-rooted affiliation with the ancestral territory, worldview, traditional medicine, kinship ties, and characteristic normative system, and thus do not qualify to be granted legal recognition. Then,
This is Suba.
yeah, it's Suba. Then, the community turned to cultural recovery as a strategy to comply with these legal requisites. They began a process to learn the language, recover the pre-Hispanic history, and women focus on recovering the recent past. This cultural recovery strategy proved successful in 2007 when the Cabildo regained legal recognition. The rural cabildos were also affected by the suspicions of government officers. In 1996, the General Division of Indigenous Affairs, which is from the Ministry of Interior, in charge of granting legal recognition to indigenous communities, wrote official memos warning local authorities about, and I quote, the doubts and conflicts about the real ethnic identity of the people of the Resguardo de Cota, which had been granted recognition in 1995. The episode was only the beginning of a long battle for recognition. The ministry had requested as proof of their indigeneity an ethnological study of the collective identity of these 3 communities, but declined to develop it for a decade. After the 3 rural cabildos set a collective action for protection, or tutela, the Supreme Court forced the ministry to develop the ethnological study. The study evidenced the continuous collective ownership of a fragment of the original territory and the continuation of social and cultural practices attached to it. The ministry had to finally certify these 3 rural Muisca communities in 2002. The negative reaction of the nation states towards indigenous claims by creating bureaucratic maneuvers to stop the recognition of groups who were currently in the process of obtaining it and withdrawing recognition to previously recognized indigenous groups goes against the multicultural politics it established. It is a contradiction that despite the invitation of the multicultural reform to recuperate ethnic roots, the re-emergence of indigenous groups is not without legal obstacles. Why does the nation-state set legal difficulties for the recognition of these communities? The official resistance is related to the difficulty of the communities to comply with the requisites for the recognition. To recognize an indigenous group, the Colombian nation-state requires evidencing 2 things. 1, the continuation of historical relation with the territory, and 2, the continuation of diacritic markers. The Muisca community have not had a problem with the first issue because they already found official documents from colonial times where they set the colonial cabildos documents, and they include a census of the indigenous people by the end of the colonial period. And with the last names, they can claim their ethnicity. They claim that they're descendants of the family Chiguasuke or the family Yopasa. And in that way, they can clearly show that they have continued living in the territory. However, the continuation of diacritic markers is intended through cultural revitalization. But here is where they have problems. The nation states requires to evidence easily observable features such as distinctive language, rituals, or clothing, and other cultural aspects which are considered unequivocal symbols of indigenous identity. These diacritical markers stimulates the production of an essentialized notion of indigeneity. In other words, Indians need to recover a primordial Indianness to cope with the requirements of the Colombian state. Re-emerging groups have a hard time evidencing these features precisely because they are in the process of reconstructing their indigenous identity and culture. The re-emerging communities thus focus their efforts to the strategy of culture and historical recovery and revival as a route to political recognition and legitimacy. The Muiscas are currently focusing on the revitalization of the language, musical traditions, and the revival of traditional healing forms. According to different ethnographers of contemporary Muisca groups, they incorporate references from the colonial archive and the scholars' interpretations of it into their contemporary cultural practices. Here is where I turn to music again. I would like to explain how the musical practices contribute to the Muisca revitalization and the legitimization of the community in the public sphere, or how the musical practices trick the essentialistic requirements of a primordial Indianness. My fieldwork within Muisca communities has revealed a wide range of musical practices. These vary from ceremonial to Andean music, including also incredible genres such as Muisca reggae or Muisca heavy metal. And there are local variations depending on the cabildo. There's a tendency, however, in all the cabildos to associate ceremonial music practices with private community affairs, while Andean music, probably the most popular music style in the cabildos, and remember that we listened the hymn of the community, it's a Pan-Andean style, is associated with the public performance of indigeneity. Andean influenced Muisca practices are based on the folkloric Andean style. And this is very interesting. It's a cosmopolitan popular practice inspired by the indigenous music of the Bolivian and Peruvian Andes, which includes the use of indigenous instruments such as panpipes. This music, which transformed from participatory performance within indigenous communities to globally circulating idiom characterized by professional presentation in concert halls and clubs, originated with urban musicians performing between Buenos Aires and Paris in the 1950s and 60s. This is also very related to the left movement in the 70s in Latin America. It is important to note that while the Muiscas started playing huaynos from the 70s and 80s, they now show a marked interest for the 1990s Pan-Andean music, including tincus and chichas. Another central feature of this Andean style is that it indexes an idea of Andean indigeneity. In particular, it stages a sonic idea of a generic Andean indigenous world, which is inhabited by an essentialized Indian, which sounds a lot like what the nation state is asking for. As Michelle Vigueño explains, the Andean music mestizo bands, perhaps you've heard a couple of names, Inti Limani, Los Carcas, as the most important bands, perform an essentialized sonic idea of indigeneity through performing certain iconically Andean melodies such as El Condor Pasa or Ojos Azules, using the quena, charango, and zampoña instrument trio, and wearing traditional indigenous clothing for cosmopolitan audiences. This is the Andean band from the Cota Resguardo performing in the Bossa Festival in 2015. You'll see them performing a very popular tinku from the 90s called Cilia, which is from the Bolivian band Calamarca. And the people dancing is representing a tinku ritual combat. The shortest guy in the middle, it's Joan. He's a charango playing and singer. He's the son of the former government of Cota, who learned Andean music by studying in Bolivia for 2 years in a very famous music school. So I would like you to listen to it for a moment. What this example shows is how the Muiscas capitalize the stereotype of Andean indigeneity of the Andean style, negotiating an identity that represents them as part of the Andean indigenous world. To me, this is an outstanding feature of the Muisca Andean practices. In a nutshell, the Muiscas are appropriating a mestizo repertory that is based on an indigenous musical tradition through which they construct new forms of indigeneity in their multicultural context. And I must add that this Andean repertory that you are seeing here is not traditional from their elder generations. The elder generations perform an entirely different repertory. This music has not been present in the cabildos for more than 2 decades, the most. Oops. No. Also, the performance of Andean music in Muisca public events allows for visibility and audibility of the community in the public sphere, both in the capital city and in the smaller towns where the rural cabildos are located. The literature on indigenous music from Brazil shows how the indigenous musical practices are part of political demonstrations. For the indigenous communities of the northeastern region in Brazil, where there's a strong movement of cultural recovery, music and ritual not only have a role within their identity process, but also is used as a tool for political visibility, because these communities must evidence publicly their capacity to express culture to the nation state and other social agents. The music and dance of these groups are performed in political events, generating a symbolic capital for the communities and their leaders. Increasingly, songs, dance, and rituals are not only performed to connect the members of the community with their spiritual ancestors, but to create new political spaces so that the sacred connections can be kept alive in the multicultural regime. All of the marches, festivals, and protests in which Muiscas participate are accompanied by music. In the last video that I want to show, you will see, let me see, yeah, there it is. You will see footage from the 2013 March of the Indigenous Pueblos in Bogotá. I chose a few parts of it so you can get an idea of the soundscape of a Muisca march. How does a Muisca march that usually lasts for 2-3 hours sound? And it's always filled with music. In the events that I have attended, besides the musicians of each resguardo, Actually, the tall guy there, it's Wilmer. It's the co-composer of the children's song. And Jenny is over there, but she's not looking to the camera. Besides the musicians of the resguardo, which of course go, the indigenous protesters support the sonic demonstrations by using minor percussion instruments such as rattles and maracas, setting a pulse for the walk, or carrying musical instruments on their hands. It seems that the visual and sonic display emphasize the Muiscas as Andean indigenous subjects related to the other ethnic groups of the large Andean mountain range that crosses frontiers and national legislations. I would like to conclude by pointing out how the musical practices are linked to the conditions of multicultural politics of recognition. The Muisca musical practices reappropriate the Pan-Andean style, a cosmopolitan mestizo tradition that is inspired on the Andean indigenous music. They create an identity partially based on the expressivity that they give to the Andean repertory and to other forms of popular music. This allows them to express their indigeneity. This music does not use the mechanism of historical recovery from colonial archive. We're talking about a style that was created in the 1950s, but still satisfies the official requirement of primordial Indianness. In this way, the Andean music tricks the politics of indigeneity by evidencing the type of indigeneity required by the Colombian nation-state through resourcing to other strategies. This also shows that Muisca cultural recovery is also based on current ethnic links, which current Muiscas use to find their own place in multicultural Colombia. Only since the 1990s, the Muiscas can be an officially recognized indigenous group who is entitled by the Constitution to be citizens without having to renounce to their cultural particularities. However, exercising such a right requires a lot of cultural negotiation with the nation-state, including navigating the essentialistic legislation. The Muiscas continuing the battle for the survival of ethnic difference in hopes of guaranteeing the ethnic survival of difference for their future generations. Thank you.